Old Age. A short story by Anton Chekhov. Uzelkov, an architect with the rank of civil councillor, arrived in his native town, to which he had been invited to restore the church in the cemetery. He had been born in the town, had been at school, had grown up, and married in it. But when he got out of the train, he scarcely recognized it. Everything was changed. 18 years ago, when he had moved to Petersburg, the street boys used to catch marmots, for instance, on the spot where now the station was standing. Now, when one drove into the chief street, a hotel of 4 stories stood facing one. In old days, there was an ugly grey fence just there, but nothing, neither fences nor houses, had changed as much as the people. From his inquiries of the hotel waiter, Uzelkov learned that more than half of the people he remembered were dead, reduced to poverty, forgotten. "And do you remember Uzelkov?" he asked the old waiter about himself. "Uzelkov, the architect who divorced his wife. He used to have a house in Svirabayevsky Street. You must remember." "I don't remember, sir." "How is it you don't remember? The case made a lot of noise, even the cabmen all knew about it. Think now, Shapkin the attorney managed my divorce for me, the rascal, the notorious card sharper, the fellow who got a thrashing at the club." "Ivan Nikolaich?" "Yes, yes. Well, is he alive? Is he dead?" "Alive, sir, thank God. He is a notary now and has an office. He is very well off. He has 2 houses in Kirpichny Street. His daughter was married the other day." Uzelkov paced up and down the room, thought a bit, and in his boredom made up his mind to go and see Shapkin at his office. When he walked out of the hotel and sauntered slowly towards Kirpichny Street, it was midday. He found Shapkin at his office and scarcely recognized him. From the once well-made, adroit attorney with a mobile, insolent, and always drunken face, Shapkin had changed into a modest, grey-headed, decrepit old man. "You don't recognize me. You have forgotten me," began Uzelkov. "I am your old client, Uzelkov." "Uzelkov? What Uzelkov?" "Ah!" Shapkin remembered, recognized, and was struck all of a heap. There followed a shower of exclamations, questions, recollections. "This is a surprise. This is unexpected," cackled Shapkin. "What can I offer you? Do you care for champagne? Perhaps you would like oysters? My dear fellow, I've had so much from you in my time that I can't offer you anything equal to the occasion." "Please don't put yourself out," said Uzelkov. "I have no time to spare. I must go at once to the cemetery and examine the church. I have undertaken the restoration of it." "That's capital. We'll have a snack and a drink and drive together. I have capital horses. I'll take you there and introduce you to the churchwarden. I will arrange it all. But why is it, my angel, you seem to be afraid of me and hold me at arm's length? Sit a little nearer. There is no need for you to be afraid of me nowadays. He. At one time, it is true, I was a cunning blade, a dog of a fellow. No one dared approach me. But now I am stiller than water and humbler than the grass. I have grown old. I am a family man. I have children. It's time I was dead." The friends had lunch, had a drink, and with a pair of horses drove out of the town to the cemetery. "Yes, those were times," Shapkin recalled as he sat in the sledge. "When you remember them, you simply can't believe in them. Do you remember how you divorced your wife? It's nearly 20 years ago, and I dare say you have forgotten it all, but I remember it as though I divorced you yesterday. Good Lord, what a lot of worry I had over it. I was a sharp fellow, tricky and cunning, a desperate character. Sometimes I was burning to tackle some ticklish business, especially if the fee were a good one, as for instance in your case. What did you pay me then? 5 or 6,000. That was worth taking trouble for, wasn't it? You went off to Petersburg and left the whole thing in my hands to do the best I could, and though Sofya Mihailovna, your wife, came only of a merchant family, she was proud and dignified. To bribe her to take the guilt on herself was difficult, awfully difficult. I would go to negotiate with her, and as soon as she saw me, she called to her maid, "Masha, didn't I tell you not to admit that scoundrel?" Well, I tried one thing and another. I wrote her letters and contrived to meet her accidentally. It was no use. I had to act through a third person. I had a lot of trouble with her for a long time, and she only gave in when you agreed to give her 10,000. She couldn't resist 10,000. She couldn't hold out. She cried. She spat in my face, but she consented. She took the guilt on herself. I thought it was 15,000 she had from me, not 10, said Uzelkov. Yes, yes, 15. I made a mistake, said Shapkin in confusion. It's all over and done with, though. It's no use concealing it. I gave her 10 and the other 5 I collared for myself. I deceived you both. It's all over and done with. It's no use to be ashamed. And indeed, judge for yourself, Boris Petrovitch. Weren't you the very person for me to get money out of? You were a wealthy man and had everything you wanted. Your marriage was an idle whim, and so was your divorce. You were making a lot of money. I remember you made a scoop of 20,000 over one contract. Whom should I have fleeced if not you? And I must own I envied you. If you grabbed anything, they took off their caps to you, while they would thrash me for a rouble and slap me in the face at the club. But there, why recall it? It is high time to forget it. Tell me, please, how did Sofya Mihailovna get on afterwards? With her 10,000? Very badly. God knows what it was. She lost her head, perhaps, or maybe her pride and her conscience tormented her at having sold her honor, or perhaps she loved you. But do you know, she took to drink. As soon as she got her money, she was off driving about with officers. It was drunkenness, dissipation, debauchery. When she went to a restaurant with officers, she was not content with port or anything light. She must have strong brandy, fiery stuff to stupefy her. Yes, she was eccentric. I had a lot to put up with from her. Sometimes she would take offense at something and begin being hysterical. And what happened afterwards? 1 week passed, and then another. I was sitting at home, writing something. All at once the door opened and she walked in, drunk. Take back your cursed money, she said, and flung a roll of notes in my face. So she could not keep it up. I picked up the notes and counted them. It was 500 short of the 10,000, so she had only managed to get through 500. Where did you put the money? It's all ancient history. There's no reason to conceal it now. In my pocket, of course. Why do you look at me like that? Wait a bit for what will come later. It's a regular novel, a pathological study. A couple of months later, I was going home one night in a nasty drunken condition. I lighted a candle, and lo and behold. Sofya Mihailovna was sitting on my sofa, and she was drunk too, and in a frantic state, as wild as though she had run out of bedlam. Give me back my money, she said. I have changed my mind. If I must go to ruin, I won't do it by halves. I'll have my fling. Be quick, you scoundrel. Give me my money. A disgraceful scene. And you? Gave it her? I gave her, I remember, 10 roubles. Oh, how could you? Cried Uzelkov, frowning. If you couldn't or wouldn't have given it her, you might have written to me. And I didn't know. I didn't know. My dear fellow, what use would it have been for me to write, considering that she wrote to you herself when she was lying in the hospital afterwards? Yes, but I was so taken up then with my second marriage. I was in such a whirl that I had no thoughts to spare for letters. But you were an outsider. You had no antipathy for Sofya. Why didn't you give her a helping hand? You can't judge by the standards of today, Boris Petrovitch. That's how we look at it now, but at the time we thought very differently. Now maybe I'd give her 1,000 roubles, but then even that 10-rouble note I did not give her for nothing. It was a bad business. We must forget it. But here we are. The sledge stopped at the cemetery gates. Uzelkov and Shapkin got out of the sledge, went in at the gate, and walked up a long, broad avenue. The bare cherry trees and acacias, the grey crosses and tombstones were silvered with hoarfrost. Every little grain of snow reflected the bright, sunny day. There was the smell there always is in cemeteries, the smell of incense and freshly dug earth. Our cemetery is a pretty one, said Uzelkov. Quite a garden. Yes, but it is a pity thieves steal the tombstones. And over there, beyond that iron monument on the right, Sofia Mihailovna is buried. Would you like to see?" The friends turned to the right and walked through the deep snow to the iron monument. "Here it is," said Shapkin, pointing to a little slab of white marble. "A lieutenant put the stone on her grave." Uzelkov slowly took off his cap and exposed his bald head to the sun. Shapkin, looking at him, took off his cap too, and another bald patch gleamed in the sunlight. There was the stillness of the tomb all around, as though the air too were dead. The friends looked at the grave, pondered, and said nothing. "She sleeps in peace," said Shapkin, breaking the silence. "It's nothing to her now that she took the blame on herself and drank brandy. You must own, Boris Petrovitch." "Own what?" Uzelkov asked gloomily. "Why, however hateful the past, it was better than this." And Shapkin pointed to his grey head. "I used not to think of the hour of death. I fancied I could have given death points and won the game if we had had an encounter. But what's the good of talking?" Uzelkov was overcome with melancholy. He suddenly had a passionate longing to weep, as once he had longed for love, and he felt those tears would have tasted sweet and refreshing. A moisture came into his eyes, and there was a lump in his throat, but Shapkin was standing beside him, and Uzelkov was ashamed to show weakness before a witness. He turned back abruptly and went into the church. Only 2 hours later, after talking to the churchwarden and looking over the church, he seized a moment when Shapkin was in conversation with the priest and hastened away to weep. He stole up to the grave secretly, furtively, looking round him every minute. The little white slab looked at him pensively, mournfully, and innocently, as though a little girl lay under it instead of a dissolute, divorced wife. To weep! Thought Uzelkov. But the moment for tears had been missed. Though the old man blinked his eyes, though he worked up his feelings, the tears did not flow, nor the lump come in his throat. After standing for 10 minutes, with a gesture of despair, Uzelkov went to look for Shapkin. In Exile, a short story by Anton Chekhov. Old Semyon, nicknamed Kani, and a young Tatar, whom no one knew by name, were sitting on the riverbank by the campfire. The other 3 ferrymen were in the hut. Semyon, an old man of 60, lean and toothless, but broad-shouldered and still healthy-looking, was drunk. He would have gone in to sleep long before, but he had a bottle in his pocket, and he was afraid that the fellows in the hut would ask him for vodka. The Tatar was ill and weary, and wrapping himself up in his rags was describing how nice it was in the Simbirsk province, and what a beautiful and clever wife he had left behind at home. He was not more than 25, and now, by the light of the campfire, with his pale and sick, mournful face, he looked like a boy. "To be sure, it is not paradise here," said Kani. "You can see for yourself. The water, the bare banks, clay, and nothing else. Easter has long passed, and yet there is ice on the river, and this morning there was snow." It's bad, said the Tatar, and looked round him in terror. The dark, cold river was flowing 10 paces away. It grumbled, lapped against the hollow clay banks, and raced on swiftly towards the faraway sea. Close to the bank, there was the dark blur of a big barge, which the ferryman called a carboss. Far away on the further bank, lights, dying down and flickering up again, zigzagged like little snakes. They were burning last year's grass. And beyond the little snakes, there was darkness again. Their little icicles could be heard knocking against the barge. It was damp and cold. The Tatar glanced at the sky. There were as many stars as at home, and the same blackness all round, but something was lacking. At home in the Simbirsk province, the stars were quite different, and so was the sky. It's bad, he repeated. "You will get used to it," said Semyon, and he laughed. Now you are young and foolish. The milk is hardly dry on your lips, and it seems to you in your foolishness that you are more wretched than anyone. But the time will come when you will say to yourself, I wish no one a better life than mine. You look at me. Within a week the floods will be over, and we shall set up the ferry. You will all go wandering off about Siberia, while I shall stay and shall begin going from bank to bank. I've been going like that for 22 years, day and night. The pike and the salmon are under the water while I am on the water, and thank God for it. I want nothing. God give everyone such a life. The Tatar threw some dry twigs on the campfire, lay down closer to the blaze, and said, My father is a sick man. When he dies, my mother and wife will come here. They have promised. And what do you want your wife and mother for? Asked Canny. That's mere foolishness, my lad. It's the devil confounding you, damn his soul. Don't you listen to him, the cursed one. Don't let him have his way. He is at you about the women, but you spite him. Say, I don't want them. He is on at you about freedom, but you stand up to him and say, I don't want it. I want nothing, neither father nor mother, nor wife, nor freedom, nor post, nor paddock. I want nothing, damn their souls. Semyon took a pull at the bottle and went on, I am not a simple peasant, not of the working class, but the son of a deacon, and when I was free I lived at Kursk. I used to wear a frock coat, and now I have brought myself to such a pass that I can sleep naked on the ground and eat grass, and I wish no one a better life. I want nothing, and I am afraid of nobody, and the way I look at it is that there is nobody richer and freer than I am. When they sent me here from Russia from the first day I stuck it out, I want nothing. The devil was at me about my wife, and about my home, and about freedom, but I told him, I want nothing. I stuck to it, and here you see, I live well, and I don't complain. And if anyone gives way to the devil and listens to him, if but once he is lost, there is no salvation for him. He is sunk in the bog to the crown of his head, and will never get out. It is not only a foolish peasant like you, but even gentlemen, well-educated people are lost. 15 years ago they sent a gentleman here from Russia. He hadn't shared something with his brothers and had forged something in a will. They did say he was a prince or a baron, but maybe he was simply an official. Who knows? Well, the gentleman arrived here, and first thing he bought himself a house and land in Mukhortinsko. I want to live by my own work, says he, in the sweat of my brow, for I am not a gentleman now, says he, but a settler. Well, says I, God help you, that's the right thing. He was a young man then, busy and careful. He used to mow himself and catch fish and ride 60 miles on horseback. Only this is what happened. From the very first year he took to riding to Girino for the post. He used to stand on my ferry and sigh, Semyon, how long it is since they sent me any money from home. You don't want money, Vasily Sergeyitch, says I. What use is it to you? You cast away the past and forget it as though it had never been at all, as though it had been a dream, and begin to live anew. Don't listen to the devil, says I. He will bring you to no good. He'll draw you into a snare. Now you want money, says I. But in a very little while you'll be wanting something else, and then more and more. If you want to be happy, says I, the chief thing is not to want anything. Yes. If, says I, if fate has wronged you and me cruelly, it's no good asking for her favor and bowing down to her, but you despise her and laugh at her, or else she will laugh at you. That's what I said to him. 2 years later, I ferried him across to this side, and he was rubbing his hands and laughing. I am going to Girino to meet my wife, says he. She was sorry for me, says he. She has come. She is good and kind. And he was breathless with joy. So a day later he came with his wife, a beautiful young lady in a hat. In her arms was a baby girl, and lots of luggage of all sorts, and my Vasily Sergeyitch was fussing round her. He couldn't take his eyes off her and couldn't say enough in praise of her. Yes, brother Semyon, even in Siberia people can live. Oh, all right, thinks I. It will be a different tale presently. and from that time forward he went almost every week to inquire whether money had not come from Russia. He wanted a lot of money. "She's losing her youth and beauty here in Siberia for my sake," says he, "and sharing my bitter lot with me, and so I ought," says he, "to provide her with every comfort." To make it livelier for the lady, he made acquaintance with the officials and all sorts of riff-raff. And of course he had to give food and drink to all that crew, and there had to be a piano and a shaggy lapdog on the sofa. Plague take it. Luxury, in fact, self-indulgence. The lady did not stay with him long. How could she? The clay, the water, the cold, no vegetables for you, no fruit. All around you ignorant and drunken people, and no sort of manners, and she was a spoilt lady from Petersburg or Moscow. To be sure, she moped. Besides, her husband, say what you like, was not a gentleman now, but a settler, not the same rank. 3 years later, I remember, on the eve of the Assumption, there was shouting from the further bank. I went over with the ferry, and what do I see but the lady, all wrapped up, and with her a young gentleman, an official, a sledge with 3 horses. I ferried them across here. They got in and away like the wind. They were soon lost to sight, and towards morning Vasily Sergeyitch galloped down to the ferry. "Didn't my wife come this way with a gentleman in spectacles, Semyon?" "She did," said I. "You may look for the wind in the fields." He galloped in pursuit of them. For 5 days and nights he was riding after them. When I ferried him over to the other side afterwards, he flung himself on the ferry and beat his head on the boards of the ferry and howled. "So that's how it is," says I. I laughed and reminded him, people can live even in Siberia, and he beat his head harder than ever. Then he began longing for freedom. His wife had slipped off to Russia, and of course he was drawn there to see her and to get her away from her lover. And he took, my lad, to galloping almost every day, either to the post or the town to see the commanding officer. He kept sending in petitions for them to have mercy on him and let him go back home. And he used to say that he had spent some 200 rubles on telegrams alone. He sold his land and mortgaged his house to the Jews. He grew grey and bent and yellow in the face, as though he was in consumption. If he talked to you, he would go, "Key, key, key," and there were tears in his eyes. He kept rushing about like this with petitions for 8 years, but now he has grown brighter and more cheerful again. He has found another whim to give way to. You see, his daughter has grown up. He looks at her, and she is the apple of his eye. And to tell the truth, she is all right, good-looking, with black eyebrows and a lively disposition. Every Sunday he used to ride with her to church in Girino. They used to stand on the ferry, side by side. She would laugh, and he could not take his eyes off her. "Yes, Semyon," says he, "people can live even in Siberia. Even in Siberia there is happiness. Look," says he, "what a daughter I have got. I warrant you wouldn't find another like her for 1,000 versts round." "Your daughter is all right," says I. "That's true, certainly." But to myself I thought, wait a bit. The wench is young, her blood is dancing. She wants to live, and there is no life here. And she did begin to pine, my lad. She faded, and now she can hardly crawl about. Consumption. So you see what Siberian happiness is, damn its soul. You see how people can live in Siberia. He has taken to going from one doctor to another and taking them home with him. As soon as he hears that 200 or 300 miles away there is a doctor or a sorcerer, he will drive to fetch him. A terrible lot of money he spent on doctors, and to my thinking he had better have spent the money on drink. She'll die just the same. She is certain to die, and then it will be all over with him. He'll hang himself from grief or run away to Russia. That's a sure thing. He'll run away and they'll catch him. Then he will be tried, sent to prison. He will have a taste of the lash. "Good, good," said the Tatar, shivering with cold. "What is good?" asked Kenny. "His wife, his daughter. What of prison and what of sorrow? Anyway, he did see his wife and his daughter. You say, want nothing, but nothing is bad. His wife lived with him 3 years. That was a gift from God. Nothing is bad, but 3 years is good. How not understand? Shivering and hesitating, with effort picking out the Russian words of which he knew but few, the Tatar said that God forbid one should fall sick and die in a strange land and be buried in the cold and dark earth. That if his wife came to him for one day, even for 1 hour, that for such happiness he would be ready to bear any suffering and to thank God. Better 1 day of happiness than nothing. Then he described again what a beautiful and clever wife he had left at home. Then, clutching his head in both hands, he began crying and assuring Semyon that he was not guilty and was suffering for nothing. His 2 brothers and an uncle had carried off a peasant's horses and had beaten the old man till he was half dead, and the commune had not judged fairly, but had contrived a sentence by which all the 3 brothers were sent to Siberia, while the uncle, a rich man, was left at home. "You will get used to it," said Semyon. The Tatar was silent and stared with tear-stained eyes at the fire. His face expressed bewilderment and fear, as though he still did not understand why he was here in the darkness and the wet beside strangers, and not in the Simbursk province. Kani lay near the fire, chuckled at something, and began humming a song in an undertone. "What joy has she with her father?" he said a little later. "He loves her, and he rejoices in her, that's true. But, mate, you must mind your P's and Q's with him. He's a strict old man, a harsh old man, and young wenches don't want strictness. They want petting and ha, and ho, and scent and pomade. Yes. Life, sighed Semyon, and he got up heavily. The vodka is all gone, so it is time to sleep. Eh? I am going, my lad." Left alone, the Tatar put on more twigs, lay down and stared at the fire. He began thinking of his own village and of his wife. If his wife could only come for a month, for a day, and then if she liked, she might go back again. Better a month, or even a day, than nothing. But if his wife kept her promise and came, what would he have to feed her on? Where could she live here? If there were not something to eat, how could she live? The Tatar asked aloud. He was paid only 10 kopecks for working all day and all night at the oar. It is true that travellers gave him tips for tea and for vodkas, but the men shared all they received among themselves and gave nothing to the Tatar, but only laughed at him. And from poverty he was hungry, cold, and frightened. Now, when his whole body was aching and shivering, he ought to go into the hut and lie down to sleep. But he had nothing to cover him there, and it was colder than on the river bank. Here he had nothing to cover him either, but at least he could make up the fire. In another week, when the floods were quite over and they set the ferry going, none of the ferrymen but Semyon would be wanted, and the Tatar would begin going from village to village, begging for alms and for work. His wife was only 17. She was beautiful, spoilt, and shy. Could she possibly go from village to village, begging alms with her face unveiled? No, it was terrible even to think of that. It was already getting light. The barge, the bushes of willow on the water, and the waves could be clearly discerned, and if one looked round, there was the steep clay slope. At the bottom of it, the hut thatched with dingy brown straw, and the huts of the village lay clustered higher up. The cocks were already crowing in the village. The rusty red clay slope, the barge, the river, the strange, unkind people, hunger, cold, illness, perhaps all that was not real. Most likely it was all a dream, thought the Tatar. He felt that he was asleep and heard his own snoring. Of course he was at home in the Simbursk province, and he had only to call his wife by name for her to answer, and in the next room was his mother. What terrible dreams there are, though. What are they for? The Tatar smiled and opened his eyes. What river was this? The Volga. Snow was falling. "Boat!" was shouted on the further side. "Boat!" The Tatar woke up and went to wake his mates and row over to the other side. The ferrymen came on to the riverbank, putting on their torn sheepskins as they walked, swearing with voices husky from sleepiness and shivering from the cold. On waking from their sleep, The river, from which came a breath of piercing cold, seemed to strike them as revolting and horrible. They jumped into the barge without hurrying themselves. The Tatar and the 3 ferrymen took the long, broad-bladed oars, which in the darkness looked like the claws of crabs. Semyon leaned his stomach against the tiller. The shout on the other side still continued, and 2 shots were fired from a revolver, probably with the idea that the ferrymen were asleep or had gone to the pothouse in the village. "All right, you have plenty of time," said Semyon, in the tone of a man convinced that there was no necessity in this world to hurry, that it would lead to nothing anyway. The heavy, clumsy barge moved away from the bank and floated between the willow bushes, and only the willows, slowly moving back, showed that the barge was not standing still, but moving. The ferryman swung the oars evenly in time. Semyon lay with his stomach on the tiller, and describing a semicircle in the air, flew from one side to the other. In the darkness, it looked as though the men were sitting on some antediluvian animal with long paws and were moving on it through a cold, desolate land, the land of which one sometimes dreams in nightmares. They passed beyond the willows and floated out into the open. The creak and regular splash of the oars was heard on the further shore, and a shout came, "Make haste! Make haste!" Another 10 minutes passed, and the barge banged heavily against the landing stage. "And it keeps sprinkling and sprinkling," muttered Semyon, wiping the snow from his face. "And where it all comes from, God only knows." On the bank stood a thin man of medium height in a jacket lined with fox fur and in a white lambskin cap. He was standing at a little distance from his horses and not moving. He had a gloomy, concentrated expression, as though he were trying to remember something, and angry with his untrustworthy memory. When Semyon went up to him and took off his cap, smiling, he said, "I am hastening to Anastasievka. My daughter's worse again, and they say that there is a new doctor at Anastasievka." They dragged the carriage onto the barge and floated back. The man whom Semyon addressed as Vasily Sergeyich stood all the time motionless, tightly compressing his thick lips and staring off into space. When his coachman asked permission to smoke in his presence, he made no answer, as though he had not heard. Semyon, lying with his stomach on the tiller, looked mockingly at him and said, "Even in Siberia people can live. Can live." There was a triumphant expression on Canny's face, as though he had proved something and was delighted that things had happened as he had foretold. The unhappy helplessness of the man in the foxskin coat evidently afforded him great pleasure. "It's muddy driving now, Vasily Sergeyich," he said, when the horses were harnessed again on the bank. "You should have put off going for another fortnight, when it will be drier, or else not have gone at all, if any good would come of your going. But as you know yourself, people have been driving about for years and years, day and night, and it's always been no use. That's the truth." Vasily Sergeyich tipped him without a word, got into his carriage and drove off. "There, he has galloped off for a doctor," said Semyon, shrinking from the cold. "But looking for a good doctor is like chasing the wind in the fields or catching the devil by the tail. Plague take your soul! What a queer chap! Lord, forgive me a sinner!" The Tatar went up to Canny, and looking at him with hatred and repulsion, shivering and mixing Tatar words with his broken Russian, said, "He is good, good, but you are bad. You are bad. The gentleman is a good soul, excellent, and you are a beast, bad. The gentleman is alive, but you are a dead carcass. God created man to be alive, and to have joy and grief and sorrow. But you want nothing, so you are not alive, you are stone, clay. A stone wants nothing, and you want nothing. You are a stone, and God does not love you, but he loves the gentleman." Everyone laughed. The Tatar frowned contemptuously, and with a wave of his hand wrapped himself in his rags and went to the campfire. The ferryman and Semyon sauntered to the hut. "It's cold," said one ferryman huskily as he stretched himself on the straw with which the damp clay floor was covered. "Yes, it's not warm," another assented. "It's a dog's life." They all lay down. The door was thrown open by the wind, and the snow drifted into the hut. Nobody felt inclined to get up and shut the door. They were cold, and it was too much trouble. "I'm all right," said Semyon as he began to doze. "I wouldn't wish anyone a better life." "You are a tough one, we all know. Even the devils won't take you." Sounds like a dog's howling came from outside. "What's that? Who's there?" "It's the Tatar crying." "I say, he's a queer one." "He'll get you used to it," said Semyon, and at once fell asleep. The others were soon asleep too. The door remained unclosed.